And it's within Sunni Islam that Sufism and Salafism offer these distinct and often conflicting conceptions of the Prophet.
And this isn't just surface level stuff, right?
No, not at all. This divergence, it stems from foundational differences in how they interpret Scripture, their historical self-perception, even what they consider to be authentic Islam. It goes deep.
Okay, so let's get to the core conflict here. The sources seem to reveal this fundamental tension. Is the path to God about meticulously copying the Prophet's every recorded action?
It's a template.
Or is it about embodying his spiritual essence, inheriting his very state of being? That seems to be the fascinating fault line we're about to explore.
Precisely. That's a great way to put it. Sufism, which is also known as Tawassul, is often called the mystical, the esoteric dimension of Islam.
Right.
Its adherents, they embark on this journey seeking nearness to God through direct personal experience, something they call marifa.
Okay.
And through profound inner purification, or tazkiyah.
Inner purification.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And crucially, they trace their spiritual lineage, they call it a silsila, directly back to the Prophet.
Ah, so like a chain.
Exactly, asserting their authenticity through this historical and spiritual continuity. It's a living connection for them.
Okay, then in stark contrast, you have Salafism, which, as you said, is a much more modern reform movement.
Very much so. It emerged primarily in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
And its core aim?
To purify Islam, that's their term, by returning to what it construes as the literal beliefs and practices of the pious predecessors, the al-Salaf al-Layo.
Which means?
Essentially the first 3 generations of Muslims. They see that period as the golden age, the pure source.
But here's the paradox you mentioned earlier, right?
Exactly. What's truly fascinating here, and it's quite central, is that Salafism, a distinctly modern movement, actually claims exclusive rights to antiquity.
How does that work?
Well, it achieves this by rejecting over a millennium of Islamic theological, legal, and spiritual development. Things like established schools of law, Sufi traditions calling it all corrupting innovation, or bid'ah.
Wow, okay.
Yet, and this is key, for much of Islamic history, especially through the medieval period, the sources clearly show that Islam and Sufism were practically synonyms.
So historically speaking, Salafism is the newer kid on the block.
Pretty much, yeah. While Sufism represents the older, continuous tradition, or at least one major continuous strand.
And this dynamic, this modern movement trying to, well, erase the history in between to connect directly with a past reconstructed purely from text, that's the crucial frame for understanding their differences.
Absolutely. It sets the stage for everything else, that tension between historical continuity and textual reconstruction.
Okay, let's dive into the Salafi conception first then. The Prophet, as seen through their lens, our sources suggest it's primarily legislative, historical, and strictly defined by the texts.
That's right. Its intellectual ancestry is deeply rooted in the early al-Hadith movement, people who really prioritized the prophetic narrations, the Hadith. Key intellectual forebears include figures like Ahmad ibn Hanbal back in the 9th century, a major jurist.
Okay.
Then the hugely influential 14th century scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who was very critical of what he saw as theological deviations, including many Sufi ideas.
Right, he comes up a lot.
He does. And then in the 18th century, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, the preacher known for founding the Wahhabi movement, who condemned traditional practices like venerating saints as polytheism. Shirk.
And the sources also highlight that Salafism as this self-conscious global thing, it really came together, coalesced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Yes, exactly. It emerged as a direct response to major crises, things like European colonialism, the collapse of the Ottoman Caliphate.
So a reaction to perceived weakness or decline.
Precisely. Calling for a stark return to the pure sources of faith as they understood them.
Okay, so what's their worldview built on? What are the foundational tenets?
Right. There are several key pillars, and they're critical to understanding their approach to the Prophet and everything else. First, the primacy of Tawhid.
God's oneness.
An uncompromising conception of the absolute oneness of God, yes. It stringently forbids any act that could even hint at associating partners with God, what they call shirk.
And that includes?
Well, things many other Muslims consider normal, like visiting saints' tombs hoping for blessings, tavruk, or asking for intercession, tawassul, through a deceased saint, or even the prophet sometimes.
Okay, very strict on that. What else?
Second, scriptural literalism. They insist on the supreme authority of the Quran and the Sunnah, the Prophet's authenticated traditions.
The Hadith.
Yes, and crucially, understood according to their plain apparent meaning, the Zahir. This approach firmly rejects metaphorical or esoteric interpretations. What you see is what you get, essentially.
No hidden meanings.
Not in their view, no. Third, the rejection of bid'ah, or innovation.
We touched on this.
Yeah. They hold the belief that religion was perfected, completed, during the Prophet's lifetime. Period.
Full stop.
Exactly. Therefore, any practice introduced after the time of the Salaf, those first 3 generations, is considered a reprehensible innovation leading to misguidance, Dalala.
And this is why they condemn certain Sufi practices.
Absolutely. Things like celebrating the Prophet's birthday, the Mawlid, or communal remembrance ceremonies, deek. These are seen as later additions, therefore forbidden.
Okay. And the last tenet.
The rejection of taqlid, or blind following.
Mean.
They call for believers to derive their understanding directly from the Quran and Sunnah themselves. They actively reject what they call blind following of the established schools of Islamic law, the madhib, which have guided Sunni Muslims for centuries.
So bypass the traditional scholars in a way?
That's the ideal, yes. Yeah. Direct access to the source.
Now, what I found really fascinating in the material is how this methodology, despite calling for a return to this pre-modern ideal, is described as paradoxically quintessentially modern.
Yes, it's a crucial point. It really took off in the age of print, mass literacy.
Right.
Which enabled, for the first time really, a direct, unmediated relationship with sacred texts. For many people, you didn't necessarily need the traditional scholarly class in the same...
It bypasses them practically, too.
In effect, yes. And it creates this sort of flattened view of history. It suggests that you, a contemporary believer, can have the same, maybe even more authentic, access to the Prophet's intent just by reading a translated hadith collection.
Interesting. Okay, let's shift gears completely then to Sufism.
The contrast is stark.
Yeah. Sufism represents, as you said, the historical continuation of Islam's inner spiritual dimension. It's rooted not in rejecting Islamic history, but actually embracing it, building on it.
Exactly. Its historical path shows this gradual yet profound development. It started arguably with simple piety and asceticism, zuhd.
Like monks, almost.
Well, perhaps parallels. It emerged among some of the Prophet's companions, like the famous al-Sufa, the people of the bench, known for their devotion.
Okay.
Figures like Hassan al-Basri and the generation after the companions really exemplify this early piety. Often it was a spiritual reaction against the increasing worldliness they saw in the growing Muslim community.
Right, a counter-movement.
In a sense. Then, moving into the classical period, say the 8th and 9th centuries, it evolved into a more formalized mysticism. The focus shifted more towards divine love, mahabba.
Love for God.
Intense love, famously championed by figures like the woman mystic Rabia al-Adawiyya. Later, masters like Junaid al-Baghdadi began to systematize the whole spiritual path, mapping out the stages and states.
Or you get a science, almost.
The spiritual science, yes.
Yes.
And then a towering
Please don't
figure in
forget
this
to
period was
subscribe.
Abu Hamid al-Ghazali.
Ghazali, huge name.
Absolutely huge. He achieved this monumental synthesis, effectively reconciling Sufism with Sunni orthodoxy in his great work, the Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences.
Thank you for watching. Visit our bookstore on Amazon.